Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Talking Tricks, and today we are joined by Kevin Grassie. Hey, how you doing?
How's it going? Good. How about you?
So, Kevin Grassie is going to join us to talk a little bit about tricking physics. But before we really get into it, I want you to kind of give a little introduction for the community about who you are.
Sure. So, like you said, my name's Kevin Grassie. I've been tricking for about 12 years, actually. Yeah, 12 years. I grew up in Reddington, New Jersey, so there's a lot of guys down there in Vertigo now that came from that general area. But I live in South Windsor, Connecticut now, and I am a part of Trick Dynamics with Justin Carney and Melissa Bash. I'm 28 years old, and I've been coaching with them for about 5 years now. And like I said, tricking for 12 years. And yeah, I also am very into science, and I have two engineering degrees, and I'm working on my PhD in engineering too.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, and I believe I ran into a paper of yours related to tricking actually like a long time ago. I remember you said it was just like a small project you did, but I thought that was really cool. So it's good to have someone who knows their physics to talk about this. But essentially, what we're trying to achieve with this podcast is just to kind of teach the general public about physics and how that works in tricking. I think a lot of us have a lot of intuition for how some of this works, but knowing the deep science of it can kind of help you grasp a little bit more about tricking. Or at least I've learned a lot from just listening to Bryce and Kevin just go at it about physics for a while. So it's been a pleasure listening to that. I'm a huge physics nerd, but like from the outside, like I'm not super into it. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. And Kevin, I think you had some goals you wanted to do with this podcast as well, correct?
Yeah. I wanna just give some basic, you know, talk about some ideas that we all as trickers think about a lot, like blocking and certain like broad mechanical principles of tricks, because it's fascinating how the body works like a machine in the same way that things around us work like machines, and things fall under gravity, and how there's a lot of principles that connect the human body and mechanics around us. And so taking advantage of that in the sport that we all love is both intellectually interesting, but also can be athletically useful in that it can, help you have a better appreciation for execution of technique and so forth. And yeah, I mean, my fields are biomedical engineering and physics and math and all the in between. So I'm also pretty well versed in musculoskeletal tissues, and as far from an engineering standpoint. So if there's time to talk about the basic composition, structure, material properties of those tissues, it's cool, and it might give you a better understanding about, God forbid you get an injury, what you're up against and what those tissues are up to.
Yeah, that's about to be some of the research I'm getting into for this next year. So I'm very
Very
excited to
cool.
hear about that as well. But yeah, so the first thing you mentioned blocking. I'd love to hear everything you know about blocking. So let's get started with that.
All right.
Or
So
probably a good place to start would be like a good definition for blocking for like people who aren't familiar or are just like unsure what you might be referring to.
Yep.
definitely. I mean, so blocking is basically when you watch someone, run across the floor, get a lot of momentum, horizontally as they're entering a trick, and then they're able to convert that into a large, brief punch of upward momentum. So they may not drift across the floor much more, but they can convert that into like a lot of height for a big flip or a big kick or air time. And that's something that we observe a lot, but understanding how it works, why it works, and how to like exploit it is definitely an interesting topic.
And
Um,
I do want to add, Lynn, to just like from a layman perspective, blocking was always something that was like, I don't know what the hell's going on with blocking. Like I hear people say
mhm.
blocking, I kind of understand it, but I don't know what. So in my head, for the layman, the way I think about it is like you're blocking that forward momentum to take it upwards, if that makes any sense. Which I think is somewhat of a correct interpretation of. Uh, Bryce has already given me a face, but
As in, never assume that a word used in physics or really any other context necessarily corresponds precisely to the physical thing that you're thinking of.
okay.
I always imagined it came from parkour, where it's like you use a physical block to cause that ricochet effect to get upward height. But maybe that's me speculating on the origin.
Yeah, I personally had never ascribed much meaning to the name itself and just figured that it was just a word used to distinguish that one thing. Like
Could be.
Like
either way,
sidebar of like an example of that, I think in tricking is like the word vanish. Think, you know, that doesn't really aptly describe anything. It just is like a word
You know,
to put in place there.
I'm sorry, this is such an aside, but I've actually heard someone say vanish is just like a non-transition, and I think they had that argument because of the name. Weirdly
yeah, it
enough,
makes me
like they're like,
makes my head want to explode.
yeah, it's like, oh, it's basically just walking, so it's not really. Like you're just, it's not
Or it happens
really,
so fast that it's vanishing.
yeah. So
So
it's fine.
you mentioned that the large component, or at least the way that many people are going to notice that blocking occurred
Mhm.
is that someone took a large amount of translational momentum
Mhm.
going across the floor into a setup, and then was able to turn that into vertical momentum. How
Right.
exactly? What exactly are the techniques? What exactly are the strategies in their body position, in their movement that they're using in order to achieve this transition?
Right. So I guess just jumping back a sec, momentum, people hear this term a lot. It is a true, physics term, but in essence, it's, you can think of it like an arrow pointing in a direction, and it's the amount of mass you have times your speed in a given direction, right? So it's almost like the oomph you have. If someone was to try to stop you, how hard would it be to stop that object, you, from moving? So momentum has a magnitude, like how much oomph you have, and it also has a direction. So you can think of it like an arrow that can grow or shrink or change orientation. So if I'm moving horizontally across the floor, I'm running, let's say I'm doing a round off trick, I've got a large forward arrow of momentum. And if I want to soar into the sky, I've got to convert that into an upward arrow almost immediately. And so I don't have too much more of that momentum traveling horizontally, which would be stealing from my height. I want to maximize that arrow up and get the most height. And the key principle to change momentum is a force, which is, again, a pretty, layman term concept that people understand. But from a physics perspective, the only way to change your momentum over some time interval is to apply a suitable force to cause that change. This is true for objects floating in space, for us here on Earth, everything. It's one of Newton's core 3 principles of motion.
Which one?
The second law. So second law of motion is all about force equals mass times acceleration, or equivalently, force is the change of momentum with respect to time. So that could be the length of that arrow. I could speed up or slow down, but move in the same direction. Or critically, in this blocking example, maybe I'm changing the length of the arrow, but I'm certainly changing the orientation of the arrow to have my momentum directed upward. And so you can imagine, almost like you're playing pool or billiards, the way you would kind of hit one ball at an angle towards another to cause that secondary ball's motion to change direction. That's sort of what the force you impart on the floor is acting on you as. It's acting as almost a ricochet force at an oblique angle to change my horizontal arrow to an upward arrow after that quote unquote collision with the floor. So it matters what angle you attack the floor with. You'll definitely see that with athletes. If they come in too shallow of an angle, they'll continue to drift in their DOM. If they come in with too steep of an angle and hit with sufficient force, they will lose their flip, right? Or travel in their opposite of their DOM and drift in that direction. So there's a bit of trial and error and sweet spot to muscularly and mechanically figure out what is optimal for a given run-up momentum and so forth to maximize height and vertical momentum out of that block without too much energy or momentum lost in the horizontal direction that would steal from your height.
So can we get like a very concrete example? So I think maybe the easiest, and you could do a different example if you think it's easier, but like round off to backflip, I think is a very easy way to describe this.
Definitely. Or even like something that needs even more precision, like a double backflip, right? Like round off double tuck or something. That I think from all the videos I've scoured on like Loop Kicks Trictionary I was using as like my database of just things to look for. I think that's a perfect textbook example of like when blocking matters a whole lot and when it's got to be optimized the most is probably for some round off tumbling type skill. But I mean, you see it in cork and things too, or J-step cork. I mean, there's rotational motion embedded in as well. But when you do that blocking step with that 90-degree turn of the foot, you're hitting at a slant to do this, to initiate the same effect, right? If I'm traveling forwards in acquiring momentum in the beginning of my J step, but then I want to not continue to drift and blast up straight up, I've got to hit my leg at an appropriate angle so that that force in that small time window changes that momentum arrow to up.
I see. So yeah, and so once again, I guess being a little more layman with this, so the first time that blocking made sense to me was when someone explained a round off, and the fact that instead of, so like you could imagine like this is the floor right here, this is your person, these are my legs. If you come out of your round off here, just standing straight right back up, you still have a lot of backwards momentum like this. But if you come out at this angle, it converts some of that into upwards. So you want to hit the point that makes you go straight upwards or maybe like slightly backwards. I mean, there's a lot of practical considerations here rather than like, oh yeah, optimally I want to go straight up, but
right.
Yeah, I don't know. So.
Well, ideally, because what's happening, the whole purpose of doing all of this blocking, why do this at all? It's because it's a whole lot easier to generate horizontal than it is to generate upwards momentum. You can really only jump up, but you can run across the floor for multiple strides to achieve a higher velocity. Now, what tools you have at your disposal in order to convert this horizontal momentum into upward momentum is the spring capacity of the floor, the ability of the floor to flex and then return force after a few moments of flexion. So, when you go and hit the floor at an angle in order to change the direction of the force that you hit it with, if you end up moving in any other direction besides up afterwards, that's some amount of momentum that you could have put into the floor to translate upwards that you just failed to do so. So it is not optimal. You don't necessarily have to do that all the time, but ideally that is the goal, because all of that momentum going sideways, whatever it is, it wasn't something that you desired in the first place. You're trying to go up. You just can't generate upward momentum in a continuous fashion going across the floor in the same way that you can horizontal momentum. Okay.
And this might be leaking into the next topic a little bit, but does this also kind of affect I'm not sure if the momentum's the right word, but like velocity of your flip, if that makes any sense? Like I could imagine it like almost like popping your legs upwards to the point where you're flipping really hard. How does that play into it?
Yeah, so I mean, like you were saying, if this was the floor, you made the diagram of if I was perfectly vertical when I hit, I'm going to continue to drift. I mean, the real reason there is twofold. One, things around us have friction, right? So when we impact the floor, the moment our feet touch, our feet are not going to slide, hopefully, right? If the floor is like proper enough and our grip is good enough, but the feet will momentarily be static. But the rest of our body segments continue to have inertia, meaning they're not going to change their motion right away. Whatever momentum and velocity they had previously from the run up, they're going to continue to have. So if I hit dead straight, but I've traveled this way, the top of my body is going to want to continue to drift, right? And so in the worst case scenario, if you don't block at all and you just like hit, tall, I mean, maybe for like a back handspring, right? Where you want to kind of be tall or almost seated backwards to stay low and continue that horizontal momentum. And you really feel after the round off for back handspring, your upper body having that inertia and wanting to whip back and lay back into the handspring. In contrast to like a round off, really tall tuck, where you're trying to maximize that, hit the angle, hit vertical, right? And the only reason I get vertical is because my head has that inertia to continue to align on top of my feet. And then I leave the ground vertical. I don't have much rotational motion at this point, right? So I actually have to, through my core and through the tuck and the change of body shape, reinitiate that rotation. Right. The other example would be like a layout. So a layout, maybe I don't block perfectly because I want some of that backward momentum to feed into the flip, into the layout shape. And like amplify or at least assist the rotational motion rather than generating it from scratch in the air. So there's reasons why you might block more optimally or less optimally in the trade-off between height, yes, but also continuity of your setup, rotational motion, whether it be like a cart full or a round off, which has that cartwheel rotational motion. Converting that and continuously into the flip itself to make all phases of the trick, efficient and powerful and easier in that sense, rather than chunking too much.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. Like, I guess that makes sense. So, is it what you're saying that if you hit the perfect block angle, you're not really generating much flip velocity? Would I be correct in saying that, or
less so? Yeah. I mean, because the idea is it depends on how all the mechanics work, but there's a certain scenario where, if you hit at the right angle and your body aligns itself on top of your feet, you blast off. You may have some of that rotational inertia rotational motion lingering, but it's certainly going to be a much smaller angular momentum of flip than if you hit hard and whip back during that contact point with the ground, right? You're kind of transferring, but what happens there is you lose height, right? So there's this trade-off of, if you assume a fixed output of like muscle power and spring floor feedback, which, there's variability there depending on how much you engage your muscles, how strong you are, what the surface is. But for simplicity, if you just keep those variables fixed, then there is this trade-off between height and flipping, energy. At the end of the day, it has to do with the idea of conservation of energy, mechanical energy specifically. So when we go up or lift an object up in the presence of gravity, you are having to do work to do that. You have to physically do work to put something higher in the gravitational field. And so the cost of that is, if I have kinetic energy leaving the ground, energy of motion, whether that's just linear motion and or rotational motion, whatever that total energy of motion is, it gets bled off at the apex into purely, static motion as far as my vertical position, because I've had to do work to get up to that height. And then that energy pays back in the speed when I hit the ground, because now gravity is doing work on me and returning that energy back into an impact into the floor. I have some kinetic energy hitting the floor again. So there's this energy budget of, once you're airborne and you assume almost, negligible air resistance and not many other forces on you, which is a safe assumption, then you have this energy budget between how high you can go and how much energy you budget for rotational motion or linear motion in different directions.
Okay.
Why contact with the floor is actually precious. Every single second you're in contact with the floor, you're able to actually adjust the energy you have in the next trick you're doing. So you should be taking full advantage of it and pushing really fucking hard off the ground.
That's really the only times I guess, I don't know, because you can move your muscles in the air, so I don't know if that affects...
Yeah, but it's way harder to adjust your energy by doing that than it is to push off the ground.
Okay.
Well, and I should say too that to that point, because that is a bit of an important point, is that when you're in contact with the ground, that is the moment to apply external forces or torques. Torque is like a twisting force. So either forces or torques on your body, that's when you are able to do that. When you are airborne, again, air resistance is there, but it's pretty negligible with the speed at which the human body moves, right? If we were a bullet, okay, air drag would slow us down a lot. But in a second of airtime, air resistance is not going to be super important here. So while you are airborne,
physicist and ignoring air resistance.
Well, no, it's even worse than that. We can go better. Our air resistance is practically linear. Bullets you can be modeling it as quadratic.
Exactly. We're linear drag, which helps the differential equations for sure. But anyway, yeah. So in that time frame, the major forces on you, or major force period, is gravity. Once you're airborne. Right? You've left the ground. There are no more external forces except gravity. And what's critical is gravity will always act through your center of mass. So no matter how you orient your body, the physical location of your center of mass might change, but the force of gravity will always act, like the arrow of that force will always act through your center of mass. And what that means is that you cannot generate any more rotational acceleration from external forces like that, because a torque, the way you can get a rotational acceleration is a force has to be applied to you at a distance from your center of mass for a torque to happen and for you to speed up or slow down. Now, that would seem to violate what we see all the time with people like slowing down and speeding up and twisting and flipping, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But the key is that your body is genuinely an isolated system while airborne. And so what we do observe with the angular rotation rate changing is all to do with how you manipulate your body positioning while keeping something called angular momentum constant throughout the entire airborne journey. Once you hit the ground again, friction on the floor, your ability to push and apply torque against the floor will change you and slow you down and change your angular momentum. But while you're in the air for that brief bit, that is something that is fixed. And your ability to manipulate your body to compensate for angular axis rotation is the interplay.
So
we can talk more about that soon.
Tricking cannot generate an infinite energy machine.
No. There. Sadly,
okay.
We cannot create energy.
Okay.
So this is sort of gets at why a whole lot of people suggest that twisting with your legs crossed is actually superior to trying to twist with your legs side by side.
I'm curious. I actually have some things to say about this. So getting into it, why don't we just talk about twisting and flipping position?
Yeah, there's a physical reason behind this, but it gets.
I was gonna say leg crossing master race all the way.
Leg crossing master race for sure, and I have an absolute justification for it. As someone who has taken physics 1 in college, I think I would know. So, yeah.
So I want to know if this works here. Give me a second, because I have a little toy here.
Ooh.
That is a very common demo of angular momentum. Let's see. I found this in my parents' house. This is like 20 years old.
Much.
All right, now this is not. Yeah. This is not perfect because the string, I wish I drilled a hole through it because then it would like make it easier for this, but we'll give this a go. So let me make sure I have the right string in each hand. All right, so if I start this rotating slowly, you see it rotating slowly?
Mm-hmm.
But then I pull the string, see how it rotates faster?
Yep.
Nice.
And the strings are a little tangled, so it won't want to open. Let me try that again, but I'll do that one more time. But the key is that, if this is relatively an isolated object, once I apply a torque to it, so I'm the external agent, I start it spinning at a slow rate. And then by changing the distribution of the mass around the axis, that rotation rate sped up. So that is, in essence, the point of how the mass of an object, as well as how it's distributed relative to some axis, that is something called the moment of inertia. That's part one. Part two is the angular speed around that axis. Those two things together, when you multiply them, gives you something called angular momentum. And so in that demo, angular momentum was always the same number because I was not externally twisting it extra. But what you saw was while the distribution of the mass contracted towards the axis, so that number goes down, the moment of inertia number goes down, the angular speed number can go up in an equal proportion, so that the product of the two numbers.
It's like it's like a balanced equation. If one number goes up, the other one has to go down, and vice versa.
Exactly. So it's like inertia, a moment of inertia times angular speed in the initial state has to be the same moment of inertia times angular velocity in the final state. And so if one goes up by a factor of 2 or something, the other must go down by a factor of 2. And again, that's all when you're in an isolated system without any external forces or torques applied to you, which, like I said, is generally the case when you're airborne in a trick, right? Gravity cannot apply a torque on your body because it acts through the axis or through your center of mass. That's sort of the key. So when you're flipping and twisting, what's really, really counterintuitive and bizarre is that the angular momentum vector that I just said is constant when you're airborne is not always parallel to the axis of rotation. This is very weird to imagine. Without getting too much in the math, basically the angular velocity vector. That's an arrow that literally shows you like, okay, what's the axis of rotation, and all the parts of the object are rotating around that axis. But depending on how the object's mass is distributed, so for a human, if we're asymmetrically distributed, let's say we're doing cork snap and we have that outstretched asymmetry and then we recombine, there's a lot of, we're non-rigid objects as people. And so there is a lot of asymmetry in this distribution. And so what's critical is when the angular momentum and the angular velocity are not in the same direction, there are some weird effects that can happen where that axis of rotation, the angular velocity arrow, can meander and change orientation while not violating this principle of conservation of angular momentum. So the angular momentum is the same, but our change in body shape in real time during a trick can wobble and make the angular axis precess and change orientation. So you can basically steal some of your initial axis of flipping into an additional axis of twisting. But if you do all the math and the dust settles, the angular momentum vector did not change. So it's a very bizarre, it would help to do biomechanical modeling to really get, a clear, like with motion capture and estimates of body proportion of mass on different segments of the person's body. But it would be really cool to see that, physical principle confirmed as a way of understanding the mechanism behind certain tricks and how you can twist and flip simultaneously.
But before we move on from moment of inertia to precession, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned that moment of inertia, which is to rotation as mass is to linear motion, in
Correct.
that it represents how difficult it is to accelerate us rotationally, how difficult it is to apply torques to us.
Right.
You mentioned that it was changing. It was either getting larger or smaller as the mass distribution was moved further or closer to the axis about which the rotation was occurring.
Yep.
That means that how much the mass is distributed along that axis, basically how tall you are, theoretically has no influence on how quickly or slowly
Bryce,
you
you're
rotate.
so salty about that one trick.
I just it's
You're
worth
so
people.
salty.
It's just worth knowing, right?
Well, here's what I'll say. So you're thinking of moment of inertia just along that single axis.
Yeah.
The reality of it is moment of inertia is not just a number like mass. Mass is a number, 10 kilograms, right? Moment of inertia is something a little more complicated in general. It's what is called in math a matrix. So picture a table of numbers, 3x3 grid of numbers. If you've never taken certain math classes, basically the job of a matrix is to take one arrow, one vector, and transform it into another one. So that could be stretching it, shrinking it, changing orientation. But the point is if I have an arrow, I can describe that with an X, a Y, and a Z component, right? Like some arrow has 3 degrees of freedom to it. And that's like, let's say that's my input arrow. And then my output arrow also has 3 degrees of freedom to it. So so 3 times 3 is 9, right? That gives you that 3x3 grid of numbers. That's basically like the recipe for transforming one arrow into the other. All this to say that unlike, force and acceleration, where the force arrow is exactly in the same direction as the acceleration arrow. So mass is just a number. In general, like I said, how angular velocity and angular momentum may be in different directions. So the conversion between them, this moment of inertia concept, is a matrix. And so along different axes of three-dimensional space, the distribution of any object, like your body, will have different moments of inertia depending on which axis you inquire about. And those axes don't necessarily have to be like, okay, up and down, head to toe, left and right. They could be any rotational
space. Yeah.
Right. You can pick any coordinate system you want, and you'll have a different set of 9 numbers in that grid. But the geometric meaning of what that grid represents is the same. It's the idea that your body has mass and is distributed around some predefined axis of rotation that you're inquiring about. So, Bryce, like you're saying, if you're head to toe axis, right? The amount of mass up and down, how tall you are, doesn't matter for, just twisting like around your longitudinal axis. But it certainly matters when you're flipping around an axis transverse through you, because now the mass is more distributed farther away from that flipping axis.
On the topic of making twisting easier or harder, though, people have contended that being taller makes twisting more difficult. Bringing up the concept of transitioning angular momentum from different axes into other axes, I conjecture that actually, because taller trickers are able to store more angular momentum while flipping just as slowly and or quickly as a shorter person at a lower height, they actually have a much higher capacity to convert their flip angular momentum into twist angular momentum, and theoretically should be able to twist better.
I see some head shakes, but I can't disagree, because yeah, I mean, like, it's a good point, right? Like, if you're taller, you have more mass distributed farther from that hip to hip axis. And so if you are completing, like, let's say a layout, like a back layout, in approximately the same time frame as someone who's shorter, then your angular speed on the flip axis is the same, but you have more inertia. So your angular momentum is larger on the flip axis. And to your credit, if you were to redistribute your inertia to initiate the twist similarly, then perhaps, yes, maybe you have more stored angular momentum to redistribute into the twist axis.
Okay.
I would also argue, though, that if you're taller, you also may generate more airtime, like for your center of gravity. So the time of flight might be longer. And so maybe if you and a short person do a layout in the same, well, it may not even be the same time, is what I'm saying. Maybe the angular velocity isn't the same in that.
This was asked in a complete vacuum that could never actually exist in reality. But yeah.
Thank you
for agreeing with my argument partially.
We've had the physics dudes talk. I want to hear what
this is giant propaganda. Okay, short kings stand together against big talking tricks, supporting big trickers. All right,
I mean,
short kings.
I'm not terribly tall. I'm 5'10".
That's tall.
That's taller than us.
Okay.
That's for a tricker. Listen.
Yeah,
General society, you're not tall unless you're 6 foot. But in tricking,
Right.
you're tall if you're like 5'9", in my opinion.
That's fair.
But I have to agree with Jason. I think so. Me and Bryce were fighting over this, and the main reason was because he's such a big math nerd that likes to see things in a vacuum. I think what the question on the tricking page was asking is, in general, do tall people have a harder time twisting? And I think the answer might be yes, because they tend to be bigger. And so they also, on top of being more up and down big, they tend to also be more side to side big. So
it's true. And then, I mean, you also are fighting your own inertia. Like, your muscles may have to work harder if your mass is generally further from your center of gravity, as it would be in a taller person. And so, and actually, here's an interesting thing that everyone's pretty familiar with. When you are flipping and twisting, you are in what's called a non-inertial reference frame. You're rotating, you're accelerating angularly, so there are fictitious forces. People hear about the centrifugal force. Like, if you turn a car real quick and you're sitting in it, you feel like you're thrown to the outside of the turn. In reality, you just happen to be in an accelerating reference frame. So the only way to make sense of the laws of motion in your perspective is to invent this outward centrifugal force, to explain why you're getting shoved out. But if someone's standing on the side of the road, they're not driving or moving, they would see your body attempting to move in just a straight line, and the car around you is trying to turn and accelerate you. And so they see your body trying to have this straight line motion, and then the car forces you to move. Point being is, when you're flipping and twisting and you're rotating like that, your limbs, I mean, anyone who's done dub or trip certainly has to fight this. You're feeling that centrifugal force, trying to splay your legs apart. You have to use your muscles to work against that effect, which, like I said, is not a true force. It's a artifact of you being in a rotational reference frame, where the inertia of the segments of your body, the desire for them to continue traveling in straight lines, is continuously fought against to maintain this rotation, this circular motion. So yeah, if you just have noodle legs, and dub B twist or dub core, you're going to see immediately, boop, they fly apart. So, and same with, like I'm saying, if you're a taller person, if your limbs are longer, I would argue that yes, depending on your technique and your strength, you are mechanically having to work harder to control your moment of inertia, perhaps, than a shorter person or a smaller person.
And no matter how strong you are, whenever you initiate any flip, especially anyone quickly where you're laid out, you're going to feel a tremendous amount of your blood moving to both your feet and your head. And that is going to adjust the way you rotate in the exact same way that the inside of an egg moving around,
Yeah.
the way that it rotates.
Do you guys ever get blood hand doing TDR? We like to call it
yes.
blood.
Oh
That's
my
centrifugal
God.
force right at play. Like you whip that hand too hard, and all the fluid goes right into the hand.
If I haven't TDR'd in like 2 weeks, I literally like I need to chop my hand off. Like it's
Yeah.
so bad. Yeah, I hate it.
I feel like it depends on my hydration level too, to be honest.
And that's a real in medicine. That's actually a real reperfusion injuries are actually a real thing. I mean, it's more
Yeah.
so in the case of like heart attacks and
Yeah.
and like shit like
Yeah.
that, where blood rushes in and it like creates these free radicals that kind of damage stuff. I doubt that's
Oh, wow.
actually what's happening in when we're doing our TDR thing. But
I think it's just the pressure sensors in your vessels that are like, yo, too much fluid.
I would imagine.
Yeah, but free radical sounds a lot cooler, so
That's
let's go with
true.
that one.
Not until I see a biochemical mechanism.
Yeah.
So I distracted you earlier when you had started talking about procession. So tell me.
Wait. Okay, sorry. Before we get to
Yeah.
procession, though, I do want to argue about crossing legs versus not crossing legs.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that might play into this a little bit more. Before that,
Bryce is like my procession argument yet to see the light of day.
no, I'm
We'll get there.
actually
We'll get there.
I'm very interested to hear about it, but I think crossing legs is better, and my reasoning, because I heard some ideas thrown out when we were talking about this in planning, but my idea is that when you cross your legs, it puts everything more closer to the center, if that makes any sense. I remember we were talking about maybe like, oh, there's less work on your muscles, there's less. No, I don't think that's anything. I think it's literally just it's all closer together versus if they're side by side, that you twist faster.
So yeah, I mean, I think it could definitely be both. I mean, I think the way to figure that out, ideally, like in a research setting, would be for the muscle thing. Number one, like you could put wearable EMG sensors on the body. They do this a lot in biomechanics labs. So they're Bluetooth wireless, but they're like sensors just on the outside of your skin that can register voltage in the muscles. So if that's decreased when someone's twisting legs crossed versus not, you can get a sense of muscle effort. So that's step one. But step two, certainly mechanically, yeah. I mean, this concept of moment of inertia, distributed mass relative to an axis, it's very plausible that when you cross your legs, you are able to, for more time during that twist as you fight centrifugal force, you are more able to maintain a small moment of inertia and keep things tight around that axis. Which again, it's like a feedback loop. By keeping things tight, you reduce the centrifugal force you feel, you reduce the effort you have to impart to maintain that shape. Everything improves, right? With that, rotation rate it increases when you are twisting tight like that. So, I think both could be right. I think both aspects can be right, because I think there's and the mechanical aspect you could quantify if you had measurements of the amount of mass, fraction of a person's mass distributed in their thigh, in their foot, in their shin, etc., and you make a 3D model of them in that shape versus another, and you have an axis drawn through it. You can do that's just the calculation you can do to figure out quantitatively which moment of inertia is a smaller number. And I would imagine that the one with the legs crossed is slightly smaller.
And so that's actually something I'm curious about. How does magnitude factor into this? Like, is that really going to make a difference? Like, oh, you have like 3/4 of an inch. What?
I'm in with Bryce. Every
Yeah.
bit helps.
And I agree. I'm just wondering. Like, I mean, I guess you would have to run actual calculations to know.
Yeah,
Like,
But qualitatively, like, I mean, think of where the sport's at now, right? People are trying to quint versus quad. I mean, you're getting to the point where there's the time scales are milliseconds for slight adjustments, and the dynamics are intense enough. The rotation velocities are intense enough that all these things start scaling appropriately, right? Like, small changes can have big effects because of the magnitudes of these other numbers in the equations, right? Like, how fast are you moving? What's your impulse? What's your force? What's your body mass? How many flips are you trying to do within a 1 second air time? Or how many twists are you trying to do within 3 seconds of air time? So I think it does, I think it's all about percent changes would be what would be more useful to quantify versus like absolute number of newtons of force or something like that. I think rescaling things towards, people's body weight or renormalizing against their dimension, like those are the sorts of metrics that would be more interesting to compare across tricking community, because people come in all shapes and sizes. So the absolute numbers for some of these things will differ. But if you reframe them as like, oh, such and such force relative to the body weight of the person or something like that, I think then you'll start to see some interesting trends in data.
I think too, when like you only have a limited amount of like energy to work with, and you can expend that in various ways, that you want to just maximize as much potential as possible, and capitalize on what all you're able to use. So I definitely think, I agree with Bryce and that, every little bit that can influence your tricks and tricking. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to be clear about one thing. Even though I argue for crossing legs being physically optimal, doesn't necessarily mean it's actually the right technique. I suspect, and I don't know this for sure, but I suspect there's probably more injuries that come with crossing your legs and landing with your legs crossed especially. So
right.
just at me, Frank.
to say nothing of the fact that maybe for aesthetic reasons you might choose to trick suboptimally, and that's totally fine.
That's a good point. That actually, yeah. So what you mean is like, oh, it looks better to be side by side versus cross legs. You'll do it, even though doesn't
Absolutely
look prettier
not.
for me.
Or you could on the other hand, maybe people could keep telling you that certain tricks are easier to do if you just don't do them so inverted, but you could just choose obstinately instead to keep trying them really, really inverted anyway, just because you'd rather do them that way.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah,
totally not talking from personal experience.
I don't even know what you're referencing, but
yeah.
Are you talking about Rise? It's always Rise, actually.
Actually, Snapu. I mean, I can Rise, but I have never landed Snapu, but every time I attempt it, everybody was like, wow, it looks really cool when you do it that inverted, but you can't land it like that. Just try it horizontal. I'm like, no.
I'll do it right, damn it.
I've switched to a vert aesthetic kind of thing. I actually really like it when people shirk and cork and it's basically vert. I think it's so pretty.
Yeah.
So
I do like that style too.
You mean Mega 7? Yeah, Mega 7's cool.
Vert, shirk, and cork. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, so now we can move to procession, I think. So if you'd like to...
Can we really quick talk about how the influence of our arms being, like when we are twisting, how having our arms tightly in or out, that would be related. Just kidding. I just wanted to delay Bryce's procession argument. So sorry, Bryce.
Yeah, I was literally just trying to get him to talk more about what he was saying before because I interrupted him when he was talking about procession.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to it. No, I'm in no hurry. But yeah, Jason. I mean, it's all about budgeting the moment of inertia. So your legs are one aspect. That axis runs from head to tailbone. If we're talking just about twisting, so if your arms are tighter, right, from a bird's eye view, that's only going to help you minimize your moment of inertia. And so, for a fixed amount of torque that you might generate off the ground, and then a fixed amount of angular momentum that you have in the air. Minimizing moment of inertia means maximizing angular speed or in your twist. So that's all part of that budgeting of that fixed quantity of angular momentum by contracting your distribution to boost angular speed.
And I was just bringing this up because I can think of instances where you may want to like actively slow yourself down by like expanding your arms outward.
Yeah.
Like in terms of like some vert kicks. Where you may like 777, for example, you may not want to exert full twisting speed on such a lower level trick. That's kind of the meaning to 777. Sorry, 777, but you get the idea.
Yeah,
essentially not try to perform it as fast.
Exactly, the effect works in reverse. I mean, with the ball example, my little string toy got tangled and frictiony, but if I were to release it and let the ball re-expand, the rotation rate would have slowed down again back to its original state. So same idea if you're cheat 12 and you open up that to slow and delay for the kick to happen, number one, so the audience can see it. And number two, it buys you a couple, a little bit more fractions of a second to delay your rotation, get ready for the transition you're going to do out, etc. Right? So the same effect of closing in to accelerate your rotation rate to opening out to slow down. I mean, there's a lot of parallels in other sports. Figure skating is a great playground to watch angular momentum conservation at play, right? When they open and close their body to axle turn and so forth.
So I actually do have a question about this, and I suspect the answer to this is no. But like, let's say you're putting the same amount of force, right? Is there any benefit to having your arms out here before you jump into the air and then putting them in versus just like you put in the same amount of force and you're just twisting straight from here?
You're saying while you're still in contact with the ground, you're being wide?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that is the most beneficial thing to do. I mean, I'm thinking of like Tiki doing some giant cheat kick or something where you kind of are doing this like almost like a dancer setup, right? Like the way you kind of back step or even like, I'm thinking of, it almost looks like a reverse rise, like you're going to dig and or like a wrap effect. But I think while you're in contact with the ground, you have the most potential to use the floor. And yes, you're in a bigger shape. So like generally you have to work harder while you're in that bigger shape to initiate that motion. But you also have the friction of the ground and the ground in general to work with you and to, action reaction is Newton's third law. So the more you twist your foot and pivot your feet into the floor feeds that torque back onto your body so that when you jump and depart from the ground, the floor has given you torque and angular momentum to work with once in the air. So I think also when you are outstretched or large in your shape on the ground, you're applying sufficient forces and torques in that shape through the ground so that once you ascend and you have some fixed angular momentum, then you can wrap it in tight and get the most bang for your buck from that angular momentum into whatever trick you're intending to do.
Okay, interesting. I actually didn't expect that. So
I definitely noticed that phenomenon you're talking about where Tiki will begin his cheat kicks like rather large or very open, so that way he can like pull very tight, execute his twist, and then again expand so that he can slow down and execute the kick and then proceed with the combo. So
yeah, and I mean, to circle back with that example, if he's doing cheat 12 or 10 or 14 or something crazy, blocking is at play too, right? He takes that big hurdle step and then there's that final back step with that right foot on a angle, right? It's not vertical. He digs it in, wraps it around, and it's like this, tornado effect, like meaning the weather event where it kind of scoops up into this like vortex. Yeah. So I think that's using the floor, and that's what's maybe not looked at hard enough is that the friction in the ground and the way the friction of the floor through Newton's third law feeds back onto your body is everything, right? If it was a perfectly frictionless surface, none of these tricks would be possible because you would be trying to, squish the bug and pivot and generate this twisting motion from the floor, and it would be like being on ice. You'd get nothing from it, right? So even though the floor, if you're doing a cheat setup or something, that final foot is on the ground for fractions of a second, the magnitude of the torque you're applying into the ground, and by consequence, it's applying back onto you in equal and opposite manner, is enormous in that small time frame. But it's enough when you take force times a time interval to cause a large impulse or a large change in momentum as you ascend airborne. So I think the subtlety is in these like fractions of a second windows of time where you're really engaging your muscles and using the friction of the ground and the springs through the floor, and then it plays out. It pays off in the seconds that follow once you are airborne.
Interesting. So I actually do see that we wanted to actually talk about angular momentum change during a flip before we get to precession. So maybe I think that would be more fitting here. I just don't want Bryce to talk about gyroscopic precession ever.
Yeah. So it's just not happening tonight.
Okay. I will say they go hand in hand a little. There is two types of precession. One is the famous gyroscope example. And what's happening there, I mean, even if you have like a bicycle wheel on a string spinning and you just let it dangle, if it's already spinning, it'll start to like rotate its plane of spinning around in a circle in this like mystical way. But what's happening is gravity is pulling it down. It's trying to cause a torque relative to the pivot point where the bicycle wheel is being held. And that causes this angular momentum vector that existed ahead of time because the wheel is already spinning to sweep around the side. And so if the wheel is spinning perpendicular to my finger, that's what makes the wheel of the bike, precess, they call it. It's like wandering of the arrow. So that's what's called torque generated precession, because gravity was the force applying a torque, causing this change in angular momentum. Great. That's the gyroscope talk.
But there's this also, thing, or is this an electromagnetic thing? I forget. The
right hand. No, yeah, both. Right hand rule comes up anytime a cross product comes up in math. There's a right hand rule. Yeah.
Oh.
So torque.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. Anytime you have a cross product, pull out the right hand.
Nice.
That didn't come out right. All right.
I actually don't know what you guys are talking about.
Let's explain the right hand rule.
Yeah.
Cross
right,
product is to do with orientations in mathematics. It's basically when something is positively oriented or negatively oriented, whether you're going in the positive direction or negative direction. When you're on the real line, it's really easy to say. You either walk forward or you walk backward. But when you're in higher dimensions, it's more complicated. You choose the collection of directions you could walk in. We're in 3 dimensions, so we have a first direction, a second direction, and a third direction. You pick those 3 basis directions, and then a choice of order on those 3 guys is an orientation. By swapping out any of those pairwise, you change orientation. And the cross product cares about which order you take these guys in. The right-hand rule is how you pick them. This one, and then this one. That's positive orientation.
So I'll do a little marker demo real fast. So like, pretend I have this pink marker, and the back of it here is the center of a circle, and the tip is some ball on a string rotating around in the circle. Mm-hmm. So if the ball is rotating this way, the tip of the marker is rotating that way. The green arrow would be like its velocity, right? So at any point in that circle, the tip of the pink marker is traveling where the green marker is pointing, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you do is you would align your fingers along the position vector, which is the pink arrow, the pink vector. You curl them into the direction of your velocity, and your thumb, which actually points at me right now, is the direction of the angular velocity. So you always get a third arrow out of this little, special multiplication. And this kind of procedure works for a bunch of things. So it would work for if the green arrow was a force applied to some lever. Let's say the pink marker is like a wrench and I'm tightening a bolt. And the green marker is like the force I'm using to, turn the wrench. I can use the same little right-hand rule trick. I go fingers in the direction of the pink, curl into the second vector, which is the green. My thumb points in the direction of the applied torque vector. Same thing works for actually magnetism. So if I have a wire carrying current, like electric currents going up, I put my thumb in the direction of that current and I wrap my fingers around it. And that tells me the circulating direction of magnetic field. So there's a right-hand rule for lots of areas of physics, not just mechanics, but and there's like 2 variations right there of right-hand rule.
It all comes from that positive orientation thing that I mentioned, because all of those are relying on the idea of orientability, which is a property of vector spaces in mathematics. Secretly, they're all physicists, so they would never tell you they were doing that. But as a mathematician, that's what they're doing.
It's just hitting me. Are these all arbitrary? Like we just chose?
Yeah. So at some point, right.
There are 2 choices you could make, and everybody just chose one, and it's the one that happens to go anti-clockwise. So it's
which is the same is true. If you ever see an X, a Y, and a Z axis drawn on paper, right, to represent like a 3D grid, you can tell if it's correct or not by trying the right-hand rule out. So if you point all your fingers in the direction of positive X, and then you curl them into the direction of positive Y, your thumb had better point in the direction of positive Z. Otherwise, it's as if the coordinate system was looked at through a mirror, which is fine. I mean, that's like a convention humanity could have agreed upon in another, but at some point someone made a convention to say right-handedness is what we use in coordinate systems and let it be written in stone. And that just lets us all agree on the same conventions. But that's not to say that math can't work with a left-handed convention. It's just, what the convention is for everything else to work out consistently.
Coordinate systems themselves are artifices that we just use to understand things that exist independent of our coordinatization of them anyway. So
Absolutely.
Is
Which
this
is why
not,
arrows are good.
sorry, is this not emblematic of the left twisting direction preference so prevalent in tricking? It's just a convention that we decided is the right way, light side.
I mean, that is an interesting question, right? Like, why biomechanically are people more inclined to twist left than right? I think that's a coincidence that it happens to be, right-handed as far as like, okay, curl your fingers left, like counterclockwise, and that gives me a positive
For sure.
rotation axis. But it's interesting. It's an interesting observation.
I wonder. I don't know the answer to this. Are gymnasts preferentially left twisters too, or is it more a tricking thing?
That's a good question.
And I suspect it's more of a tricking thing because of our propensity to use our right leg to like swing. Like, you know what I mean? So
Yeah. I'd also be curious because I feel like I've seen a lot of gymnasts do both. Like, you know how you'd round off on one side and then most people would twist like in a continuation of that round off direction. I feel like I've seen gymnasts do both. Like, I mean, I guess you can do both because if your round off is straight and square enough, then like you can choose to twist either way. But I would wonder the statistics there, like how many gymnasts match their twisting direction to their round off direction versus like switch it. But something I've noticed as well.
Cursory glance, I can't find anything. So,
and I was totally baiting. I don't think that there's truly like a preference. I think it is more coincidental that most people do twist to the left, and I think it may have something to do with what Frank was saying, like having to do with swing through. I think also potentially with like the teaching of tricking, because there's no like, and that most people are like, well, how you gainer is by swinging your right leg back more so than, not necessarily any biomechanic reason potentially.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that because I'm a right twister. No.
We don't have right twisters on our podcast.
Oh no.
This isn't coming out. I'm just kidding.
I mean, I do. For me, I think it came down to just I felt more stable on my right ankle, like in the early days jumping. But it's weird because I learned all my kicks left from karate in like 6 years old and up. So like I had to switch those, and I'm still working on that. But as far as B twist and cork and all the early flips and twists, I was like, right twisting feels easier. Like I guess this is easier to keep than switching my twist direction. That seems harder. But I think it all stemmed from like, and I snowboard right foot forward, like goofy. So I'm all sorts of crazy. But I am right-handed.
You're right-handed? Okay.
Yeah, it's messy. Weird. It's messy over
here. Okay. So I am curious to hear about gyroscopic precession though.
All right, I guess
with D-legs, with like all that stuff.
Well, he technically already gave us the rundown on gyroscopic precession.
Like
Otherwise,
the physics.
He gave us torque induced precession. It is exactly when you have a circular motion that would otherwise be allowed to proceed along its axis without any adjustment, but some external torque is trying to push that axis out of line, and it causes that axis to sweep out an otherwise conical shape.
So do I have screen sharing ability? Because I have one single slide that will make this perfect if possible.
I got you. Let me just share this with you really quick.
Yes.
I need to make you the host.
Okay, and then I guess I can swap or like send it back if
I don't care. Make host.
Okay.
And then let me just make sure that the audience can see this, which is here.
All right, let's see here. All right, can you see the gyroscope slide?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so we'll get to the videos in a second. But so this is what I was mentioning first, right? So if this, actually, I look at the bike wheel. That's the easiest picture, right? So it's already spinning. This spoke right here, pointing out at us right now, and then going to the right. That is the direction of angular momentum. And so you see it sweeping around sideways because while the bike is on that string, gravity's trying to pull it down, almost like it was trying to hang underneath the string. But while the bike wheel already is spinning, there is already pre-existing angular momentum. So rather than it just dropping and sagging below the string, the only way the torque can act on that wheel is to simply make the angular momentum navigate and wander sideways. And so you get the fact that the wheel's spinning, but then the whole plane of spinning drifts, circularly. So that's, like you said, torque induced. But really, for tricking, torque-free precession is really what's fascinating because, like I said, gravity when we're airborne is the only force acting through our center of mass. And so that is the gravity cannot apply an external torque relative to our center of mass. So remember this right-hand rule trick. Well, one of those fingers on the right-hand rule is a distance from a pivot. And so if the force of gravity is acting through the pivot, which is our center of mass, there's no torque. But yet you can still make the angular velocity drift around while the angular momentum does not change. And so I actually have these two cool videos side by side here. So this guy on the right's doing like a Rudy, I think, or maybe a front dub. But on the left is a rigid body. And you can see how both are twisting the same way, even though while they're both airborne, there's no net torque applied to them. It's just a fact of when you're rotating around an axis where you have an intermediate amount of inertia, there is some instability. And so you'll see the rotation of the block start to break and spin on multiple axes, even though the angular momentum is the same. So I actually didn't even think about that, but if you flip your iPhone or something, right, there is, you can flip it two different ways where it's like pretty stable, right? It doesn't kind of like tumble and do weird things. But if you try to flip it towards yourself, like you're looking at your phone texting, you're flipping it towards yourself, the inertia, the moment of inertia around that axis is somewhere between the minimum and somewhere between the maximum. And so that is the least stable axis of rotation. And so if you try to take your phone and flip it in front of you, you would see instabilities in that rotation and it would start to tumble on multiple axes. So here, if I'm like, that is pretty stable, right? On the long axis here. And then let's see, which is this way, right? This is also stable, relatively speaking, right? Around the largest moment of inertia. But then if I flip it this way, it may be hard to see with the frame rate, but it's really hard, if not impossible, to get it to flip just on this axis without also rotating along the other axis. So that works for rigid bodies, but it also works, it's partly at play in non-rigid bodies in this torque-free precession when your angular axis can drift and rotate, particularly if you're like really dynamically changing your moment of inertia like you would in a flip, because we're dynamic. But that's the essence of precession is anytime the angular velocity vector, which defines the axis of rotation, wanders around, right? Drifts around. And because it's torque-free, the angular momentum cannot change, right? It's the angular velocity vector that wanders instead. That is the subtle difference. And, unlike the bicycle or the gyroscope, which is torque-induced, and everybody in a physics class talks about that, torque-free precession is way more subtle and certainly way more at play in acrobatics because, like I said, there's no external torque on you when you're airborne.
And people actually, there are lots of tricks where precession is occurring, though it's actually very slight in a lot of tricks, so it's not very noticeable. One trick, though, where it is very frequently very visible is any trick that has D-leg type variations in it, because as you were mentioning, this sort of precession is generally caused by a large change in shape that adjusts your momentum, changes what axis changes your moment of inertia, and thereby what axis your angular momentum is primarily expressing itself around. When you sit down into that D-leg position, you force your center of gravity out in front of your body, and the axis about which you rotate is now going to be in a completely different location than it was previously. And you're going to see this winds up leading to the situation where lots of people attempt to double leg, but because of this precession, having the second double leg appear in the same way that the first double leg did is essentially impossible because you've swept out to another part of the cone that you weren't in before when you're doing the second double leg.
Right. It's certainly harder to maintain for that second, the exact same orientation for that second D leg.
It just occurred to me it'd be really cool to have a physics-based definition of what a flip is, because I think that would solve a lot. Because there's a lot of confusion regarding this specific thing that Bryce was mentioning, where like people delay and it's like, was that a double flip? Was that a double twist? I don't really know. And I don't know what the solution to that is. But like maybe a physics, like, oh, every time your angular momentum goes up and down, then that's a flip. Or
I think it's hard because because the human body is non-rigid, right? I mean, it'd be easy if you had like you're spinning a top right on a table. I mean, that's like what you do in physics class. You do these toy problems with rigid objects because it's very plain and simple about how if you have a spinning top and you see it wobble on the table, that is a prime example of the top is spinning on its own axis, and that axis itself is wandering around a cone, hence precession. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you're talking about the human body, there's internal force generation to some degree, like chemically through your muscles, but yet at the same time, you're an isolated system mechanically because all those pushes and pulls of your skeleton are internal forces technically. It becomes trickier because then, right, you can have, whether you define a flip based on like rotations of your head versus rotations of your hips versus feet, they may differ in some tricks. It's definitely a little harder, I think. I mean, I always went by just, hips overhead happening once at some point. Maybe that's too crude. It's gotten me pretty far, pretty well,
It's also the standard we've adopted here, so you're in good company.
I think it works most people would like 90% of cases. But I think there's times people would call something a flip that doesn't happen. But yeah, it's. I
mean, I think of ones all the time that make me scratch my head, like Shosei doing like full late swipe or something like that. Like those ones are so odd because it's like the late swipe by that definition kind of does put your head below your hips again, or like the aerial out, like full in aerial out type of vibe.
You want to know one that's stupider?
Stupider.
Donut Boy does get your head below your hips.
Yeah, that's true.
Is it a flip?
All right, no, but we're onto something now. We're onto something. I like that because Donut Boy has predominantly flat spin, right? Like, sure, you're changing your inertia to like put your head manually below your hips, but like it's mostly flat spin. So by your argument of finding some quantitative measure to declare this once and for all, in the Donut Boy, your angular momentum would be up. Like basically your body's spinning like a CD player, for the most part. Mm-hmm. And so if we're some critical orientation angle that we decide upon for some biomechanical metric of your angular momentum, then like that would be, pretty foolproof, I think, of like at what angle above the ground is your angular momentum, your total angular momentum during the trick. And if it's too high above a certain angle, it's too close to just pure flat spin. Mm-hmm. And if it's low enough, it's sufficient flipping. Like that.
And Kevin, you're balancing exactly the line that us trick theorists have to do every day, and that's how do you be rigorous but also convey
flexible.
Convey ideas in a way that's like we don't have to do all these calculations to figure it out. Like you just see it. Right. I'm being a little facetious about it, but yeah.
It's really not as difficult as we make it out. We just say we basically come up with conventions and we're like, this is the convention that we decided is best. Here's another one that's clearly not as good. Use ours.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. Hey, I mean, it's all in an attempt to analyze, right? And it grows the sport regardless because people are talking about what's going on and forging a better understanding of it.
Yeah, I just don't want to calculate angular momentum every time I see a trick.
That's fair. We just need more motion capture. More people doing mocap.
Maybe everyone should just be motion captured at all times.
I was just about to say
that would be sick.
The issue is though with like humans being imperfect and like performance being, a variable at any given point, but even between two separate attempts in the same session, one quirk could be meeting the criteria of being actually a corkscrew, whereas another session it just doesn't, and
right.
It's so hard to like. It is literally on a instance by instance basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, I do want to hear a little bit. even if it's briefly about the mechanical properties of bones and tendons, because I know you've done a little bit of research on that.
The materials.
Material properties.
Yeah.
I dissected rat tendons one time. It was fun.
There you go. I have
Sounds awful.
I have worked with human cadavers parts before, and it's been very interesting.
Nice.
But yeah. Well, let's see. Where do I want to start here? I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, you guys, I'm curious what you would like to know about. Like, so, I mean, I have notes on bone, cartilage, muscle, ligament, tendon. Yeah, like everything from structure to healing process to composition to mechanical properties to, you know.
Yeah.
So what is interesting primarily to you guys?
I mean, I guess as someone in medicine, I do want to actually like prelude the discussion with telling the audience a little bit about like how different injuries happen, and really it just depends on what gives out first. You're imparting forces on your body constantly, and what determines if you're going to get fractured or if you're going to have a tendon sprain or if you're going to see a complete tear of something else is at what point is the failure occurring, right? So like, let's say, I don't know, you're just doing like a backflip and your patellar tendon is like super weak. That's going to give out first. Obviously, your bones aren't going to give out first in that instance because that's the weak point. It ruptures, and then you're screwed in that sense.
Right.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. Like, that's kind of like a general opener to that, if that makes any sense. But I am interested to hear about, like, the relative strengths of all these.
Yeah, so again, another part of my background is in material science engineering. So to put some terms real fast about stress and strain. So if I have a rod of some object with a cross-sectional area, and I'm pulling this under tension, the force I use to pull it apart divided by that cross-sectional area is in units of pressure. And so that's like a stress, like a tensile stress. Or if I'm pushing down, it would be a compressive stress. So that's the applied loads and forces in terms of, you know, normalized by the cross-sectional area of something. Now, the deformation that happens, right? How much my little sample of material here actually elongates or shrinks. What you do in engineering is you would measure its like new length and you would divide by the old length. And that would give you a sense of, new length minus old length and then divide by the old length. And that would be strain. And strain has no units because it's length over length. So it's almost like a percent change in length or something. And the key is that you can use these two things, stress and strain. You can plot strain on the x-axis, stress on the y-axis. And for all materials, you'll get what's called a stress-strain curve, which gives you a really good objective view on the behavior of that material, at least like in that loading direction and loading condition. And you can see a lot of things about it. You can see which amount of deformation is recoverable. So if you stretch like a rubber band for a little bit and then you let go, it will come back unchanged. But there's a point with many materials where you stretch something too far and it now undergoes what's called plastic deformation. So this is a certain amount of deformation that cannot be recovered entirely and remains permanent. Beyond that, then you'd have a failure point and breakdown and so forth. So most stress strain curves, like I said, if this is stress and this is strain, things rise linearly, which is called the elastic region. So you can recover those deformations. But beyond the elastic region, you'll hit some maximum strength, a certain amount of stress the material can withstand. And then it might kind of plateau as you're getting plastic deformation. So if I let go of the load now, I only come back here, not to the beginning of my x-axis. So whatever, we're going up, we're going elastic, we get some plastic deformation, and then bang, rupture, and then the stress goes away entirely because the thing broke. So most materials behave somewhere in that range. Now, that's like steel and like industrial materials would behave like that. Now, a lot of biological materials like ligament, muscle, bone, soft tissues, even hard tissues like bone, there's more of the kind of exponential growth at first where you start stretching it and then the stress builds, then it's linear, then it might do some non-linear stuff and then rupture or something like that. So what matters is the slope of that initial phase, how steep that line is, the elastic region, is a measure of stiffness. So if I have a really steep line, that means I need a lot of stress to cause a small amount of deformation, right? So it's a really brittle or really stiff object like steel or bone, right? Versus if it's like muscle that's really compliant, I don't need as high of a y-axis value to get a large x-axis value. I can get a lot of strain for very little stress. And so that slope really can kind of characterize a material on how compliant or stiff it is. And you kind of, your body is built in certain ways for certain reasons, right? Bone is relatively stiff, at least cortical bone, the bone that's on the periphery of like your femur, let's say, whereas the bone inside, the bone marrow, the trabecular bone is a lot softer. And what's more is that, bone is still like a pretty simple material to understand mechanically because it's closer to like steel and rubber and things that we know well that are non-biological. But many other tissues, cartilage especially, ligament, tendon, muscle, they are what's called viscoelastic. So we think of viscous like honey, like a fluid that likes to flow and takes time to flow. And then we think of elastic like something that's a spring, right? Like a spring floor would spring back and recover its deformation instantly. Viscoelastic does somewhere in the middle. So the material will recover after you remove the stress, but it may do so over time. It may lag in its recovery. And especially if you apply a different rate of strain. So let's say I tension something slowly, like a chewing gum or something, versus if I take that chewing gum and I rip it real fast. The latter case will be more brittle because the rate of strain was so much higher. And a lot of these viscoelastic materials become stiffer at that higher frequency loading than a low frequency of stress. So, that alone can already give you intuition behind injury mechanisms for certain tissues like tendon, ligament, muscle, that if your body is not neuromuscularly coordinated at the right time and the right milliseconds of a movement to eccentric or concentrically contract or act in the right way to protect the joint, and that tissue is just sustaining a high rate of strain when it's not ready, then it stiffens up because of that high rate of strain compared to a slower rate of strain, like a static stretch or, some kind of like stretch, and you sustain an injury because the mechanical structure of that material cannot cope with that strain rate, and it becomes more brittle in that domain and rips or something of that sort. So that's an overview of like, mechanics of materials generally, stress, strain, and stiffness, and then how that might manifest in typical materials like steel, as well as like bone and muscle and all that. And, how you can characterize a lot of them based on their stiffness in these different loading conditions.
It was awesome. As you were describing it, I recently suffered a meniscus tear, and, I could basically like visualize all of this happening as you were describing it.
You felt how viscoelastic your meniscus was?
Yeah, tragic. Absolutely terrible. Don't injure your knee. People
I know. I tore my meniscus in 2018. Thankfully, it was just a small piece they had to remove. But cartilage and meniscus is even more tricky because it's what's called, scientists like all these, prefixes on things. It is poroelastic, P-O-R-O, because it's both a porous material where water can swell in and be exuded out, like pressed out, right? Cartilage is like a cushion for your joints and a lubricating surface. And the meniscus is a type of cartilage. It's fibrous cartilage rather than hyaline, which is like the really smooth, frictionless coatings on joints. So fibrocartilage is a little more structural, has more fibrous content to it, but nonetheless, it's got this porous and elastic property to it. So it springs back a little like a cushion, but it also has, like you squeeze it and the water or the fluid pools out slightly into your knee joint. We're talking minuscule, but then it can reabsorb, milliseconds later after the loading is removed. So that also helps distribute and redistribute the forces and strains in an ideal world, like in a non-injury case, to cushion the joint and dissipate that energy from the impact in the form of heat and friction within the synovial fluid particles.
And I think
until you into injury.
Sorry, Jason, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that, it was like exceptionally high impact landing, and actually due to me crossing my legs.
No.
explicitly. Yeah, literally, like a lot of high impact on my right knee specifically due to how crossing my left leg in front of my right leg in my twist habits. But
Yeah.
Rotational forces on the knee are typically very bad.
No good.
Yeah, it's a joint that likes to just stay in one plane. So whenever you do this type of thing, it's not good. That's why I do hypothesize that crossing your legs is not very good.
Wasn't fun. Don't recommend.
Yeah, I bet.
but something to take into account with all of this also is something that's known as Wolff's Law. And I think it's something that we are all intuitively familiar with. It's the same principle that works with us working out, essentially. When you put your body under stress, it builds back stronger. You know that with your muscles, but this is true for your bones too. Your bones are living things. So when you put your bones under stress, they do get stronger. To a lesser degree, your tendons and ligaments do, but they don't have as much blood flow, so it's a little harder for them to kind of catch up. But we do observe that, like with astronauts, for example, that experience zero gravity for a long period of time, their bones suck. So, and that's a scientific term.
Suck.
So, yes.
That's a great point, Frank. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, my PhD work is in the field of bone tissue engineering. So, tissue engineering broadly is a discipline to try to heal and repair tissues better by understanding how they heal naturally, or to the extent that they don't, to try to use the body's own innate mechanisms as well as, useful biomaterials, so implantable materials or biochemical factors that work with cells, and to understand both the structure, the function, and the cellular biology in tissues. And so bone tissue engineering, specifically what we work on in our lab, yes, it's all predicated on Wolff's Law, which is that bone tissue, especially like you said, is dynamically remodeling throughout your life, and certainly is able to adapt to the loads that you put on it. This is partially to help, store calcium or dispense calcium into the blood as needed. He mentioned astronauts, people who have long-term bed rest or in microgravity. The bone cells embedded in the matrix of bone mineral and collagen in the bones are mechanically sensitive. And there's a lot of cutting-edge cell biology research to understand how and why these cells are able to even sense mechanical forces and what protein pathways they activate as a result. But nonetheless, the osteocyte cells in the bone that maintain bone get complacent in those unloading conditions, if it's microgravity or bed rest. And they say, hey, we don't need to make as much bone. We can tell the osteoblasts that chill out, stop making bone. And then the bone resorbing cells, osteoclasts, they tip the balance in their favor and they start dissolving bone away where it's not needed. So the bone is a hallmark example of a dynamically remodeling tissue that is very economic with where it puts struts of trabecular bone to resist compressive and torsional forces for the best strength to weight ratio. And so it's not poor, stupidly designed. It's very intelligently designed. It remodels all the time. And we're actually trying to exploit that in our research by using ultrasound as a mechanical stimulus to augment those forces or supplement those forces. So at least in our lab, if you have a critical sized bone defect or some fracture that won't heal, we're trying to use low intensity ultrasound that is not high enough to cause any heating or tissue damage. It's a different frequency ultrasound than that's used for imaging, like a baby. But nonetheless, the hypothesis is that it can induce small forces on the cells, particularly when the soft callus of the bone is still healing, to trick them into being in a more mechanically intense environment and to manufacture bone more readily. So that's at least a peek into the research in my lab and some of the work that we're doing. But it's also to ride on the shoulders of what Frank said with Wolff's Law, and other tissues as well.
It is really cool to see
bone training.
Yeah.
I love bones, dude.
It's like evolution, but
so Kevin was talking about the trabecular bone. You could actually see, you guys can't see it, so I'm sorry. But there's an x-ray of essentially what a femur looks like, and you can kind of see these lines that follow the tension of what your femur would experience. So yeah, your bone cells are smart. They kind of orient in a specific way, like Kevin said. Not fully elucidated how this all happens, but very cool nonetheless. So
Yeah.
yeah.
The key to remember is all these tissues, I mean, musculoskeletal especially, but they all have a really intelligent hierarchical structure down to the protein molecular scale.
Mm-hmm.
So take bone, for instance. Cortical bone is the outer, like more rigid, dense bone, like on the edge of like the femur, or the circumference of like the shaft of your femur, let's say. And that sort of sustains, you know, the bulk of the loads. It's the strongest part of the bone compared to the marrow.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that periphery of bone has little cylindrical units side by side that are like 0.2 millimeters in diameter, called osteons. And if you zoom in on one of those, it looks like a bullseye from the top down. So it's got these concentric rings of like almost like plywood style wrappings of parallel collagen fibers in like a helical wrapping, cells interspersed between with all these tendrils to feel and sense mechanical strain. And particularly all those collagen fibers are wrapped, if you zoom in further, with nanocrystals of a mineral, like a rock, like essentially like a calcium mineral called hydroxyapatite.
Mm-hmm.
So these little nanocrystals are, I mean, we're talking nanometers, billionths of a meter, that line these collagen fibers. And so, you know, that's one example. Ligament and tendon are mostly collagen, but they're highly aligned, highly oriented. Muscle is even more fascinating in that it has nerves penetrating and a lot of electrochemical processes to trigger, you know, contraction of filaments of protein past each other. The body is absolutely fascinating, and cell biology has no shortage of amazing things to discover still.
I just, for anyone who doesn't know too much about all these processes, I do recommend looking into the sliding filament model of muscle contraction.
Yes, for muscle. It's incredible.
It just blew my mind. Like, I just, like, this happens in, like, probably less than milliseconds, honestly. I don't even know. But it talks about, like, 4 different processes. It's like, oh, calcium has to rush in, and then this protein binds to this, and then it kind of pulls your muscle this. And that happens every time, like, I move my hand like this. Like, it's just so many things. It's amazing. So definitely recommend looking into that. That is definitely beyond the scope of what we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
But
I have slides on it, but that'll have to wait.
Exactly. So I think overall, we covered a lot of topics we wanted to cover. Is there anything you wanted to bring up, Kevin?
I think I wanted to end on the future of what I would hope to be the future of like tricking research or biomechanical research in general. So like Frank said in the beginning, I did indeed, you know, have an honors undergraduate thesis that I did. It was like a small project involving some like, you know, rudimentary motion capture with tricking, like some basic tricks. And I did a later project for a class with some like force platform analysis to see like what amount of force I landed on or applied to the floor when I landed in like a cork or something, or a backflip. So it was, you know, it was an exploratory study. I had limited resources, but I have done a good amount between internships and that project and other things in the realm of biomechanics to foreshadow like what could be done in that realm with tricking especially. So, you know, the key things you'd want in any biomechanics study of tricking would be motion capture data. So like all the little markers like you would see in a movie, but to quantify how the limbs are moving and at what positions and speeds and accelerations in the air. Altogether, that's called kinematics, how something moves. Then you want to know the why. Why does something move? The dynamics. And so that would be like using a force platform that would measure the force and torque you apply as you leave the ground and then when you return to the ground. And we were saying all earlier, the time in between when you're in the air, everything is an internal force in essence, right? Because if you treat your body like the system, then gravity is the only external force, you know, making you travel in this like parabolic motion. But as far as you know, maneuvering your body, that's relatively internal. So you could maybe glean some of that from the motion capture. You could also use these wearable, they're classic in biomechanics studies, these wearable EMG, electromyography sensors that read muscle voltages through the skin, perfectly harmless and non-invasive, but you can get pretty good data about a time series of voltage readings on major muscles to see how and when they're firing and to what relative magnitude they're firing, during a trick, which would be cool insight to see, even to compare longitudinally across different triggers or different body types and see how technique temporal patterns differ, or mechanical loads differ on impact, or all normalized to like body weight and stuff like that. As we were saying earlier, a lot of this is predicated too on estimating like how much mass you have in each segment of your body. So there's some like general principles of like, okay, most people have X% of mass in their thigh or in their head, or but that certainly matters when you're doing calculations like moment of inertia. If you treat your head, your torso, your arms, your hands, your feet as all like rigid segments that are positioned in different ways, it's a bit of a crude model, but you can do pretty good simulations numerically to say, if I were to start in one position and move all those segments to another position, like a toy soldier or something, and let the computer do the work and tell you what moment of inertia number do you have before and after that transformation, and how does that affect my angular rotation, my this, my that. So I think doing numerical simulations of that torque-free precession concept we were talking about earlier, as it pertains to individual tricks, would be amazing. And all that would really require is motion capture data during those tricks and an estimation of the distribution of mass for that given athlete. And you could immediately start to do, frame by frame through the mocap data, numerical simulations, and try to tease out how exactly people are capable of applying torque-free precession, even if they don't even know they are applying it. But yet that's probably what's at play as they flip and twist on multiple axes. And then finally, I would say big data science, right? Like, I mean, beyond all these like individual studies, small scale, really nitty gritty, really technical. I think if that was off like to be carried by some research group or groups plural and like off and running, to then have data like that across different like regions of tricking, or just, statistical data across different body types or triggers, or and then how people's technique is different. I think that would be incredible for the sport as far as injury prevention, a better understanding of how different perturbations of technique manifest and which are maybe more optimal in a quantitative sense to achieve a certain trick. That's like such a long-term, goal, but it would be so cool to see that kind of data.
The future of running tricking data through gradient descent and coming up with the optimized way of doing a trick course.
Yeah, that'd be highly nonlinear system. But yeah, there's a lot of like, tried and true optimization things you could try to apply here. Now, all this, speaking from someone in academia, like research is run on funding, right? I mean, a lot of this requires hardware, software, expertise, time, training, so forth. So it's tough, right? Like it requires a lot of, manpower and resources. And the first step would be having tricking be more publicly, aware. Like, think of how big skateboarding has become, from sponsors to brand deals to, competitions and so forth, that, lay people understand more what it is. Now, does that mean skateboarding magically has grant funding from the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health? No, but it's at least a step in the direction of like, the more people or whose children do this, or, just like any other sport where there are sports medicine incentives to, research stuff like this, from an orthopedics perspective, from just a physics perspective, from an injury prevention perspective, biomechanical perspective, that would sort of be the opening the door to funding agencies and stuff caring about this sort of thing. But that is at the end of the day what would need to be, gleaned, is that kind of money for these sorts of studies. But it's not to say that, if you're a tricker and you're out at college and you're in engineering, I mean, that's what I did. I was like, hey, I have access to this mocap equipment from the institute that I'm at, from the university that I'm at. Let me just do this fun study with the professor who's going to lend me their equipment and add to the pool of next to no tricking data that exists currently. Like, there's almost none out there. So any amount of progress would be so cool to take on.
That was something I was going to say, is like literally any amount of progress in our extremely underdeveloped field. One thing that I think is kind of to tricking's benefit is that people who trick are like deeply passionate people. and usually are also like people who are interested in and passionate in other topics outside of tricking, and then also integrating that passion into tricking and seeing how they can relate, like Frank with medicine and you with physics, Bryce with math, finding ways to integrate other passions in with tricking to expose tricking to like more nuanced scientific data. And I think that is something that tricking has going for it. Like, it has a more mature base that wants to explore those topics, like is actively engaged in finding out more about that stuff, is curious.
Yeah,
It's to our
I'd love to
benefit.
see where it grows. I'd love to see where that attitude grows. I mean, like you said, the people of different disciplines and avenues, and you know, there's so many. I mean, I am the biggest proponent nowadays of like, there's so many actually incredible videos on YouTube for physics education. Like, if you're just like, I don't know anything about physics, but like I trick a lot, and I feel like physics is going on somehow, and I want to learn more. Like, there are really, I mean, you kind of have to be careful where you look. Obviously, there's always going to be some misinformation, but like, there's really good combination of rigorous like content on YouTube for physics knowledge, and obviously you can always pick up a textbook in parallel. I know brilliant.com, I don't work for them. I'm just saying that, like, I see their ads all the time. That looks like really, good for like trying out skills and stuff. And then just, yeah, YouTube having all these videos where they have animations in parallel with explanations to really hammer home like physics concepts. And anyone who wants to carry that torch, like, yeah, go for it.
I gotta give you, Kevin. I feel like I can follow along with what a lot of you guys are saying because I watch a lot of physics videos on YouTube and math videos. 3 Blue 1 Brown, great
Yes,
channel
he's the
on
best.
YouTube.
Grant Sanderson.
He's awesome. I can't even think of PBS Space Time. I love for physics, honestly.
If you need a list of like 100 channels of YouTube, I can give you a giant list.
Honestly, all the PBS channels are very good. I really like
They
them.
are.
They used to have a math one that got canceled, which sucks. But I am very curious because you were talking about the future of research and tricking, and I don't actually know what the environment looks like for research in a lot of other sports. Like, I can imagine, I know football almost certainly has a pretty big research apparatus.
Right.
I don't know about any other sport. I don't know. Does gymnastics have a lot of research? Does tennis have a lot of research? I can't tell you.
Yeah. I don't know either. I mean, all I can remember is like when I was doing that like honors thesis paper and like citing sources and stuff, I was trying to look for other, even just in martial arts, mechanical analysis, like basic karate or gymnastics, like very few studies still. I mean, certainly like rigorous peer-reviewed studies versus like mine wasn't peer-reviewed, mine was just like exploratory, but like be that as it may, there's very little. And so I think it comes down to the incentive for agencies to fund this. They have, not for nothing, but they have better things to do, like curing diseases and funneling out a finite amount of money that they have to a large pool of researchers nationwide, right? Like that's the fact of the matter. It's not to say what we're proposing isn't important. It's just how is it important to the public at large? Whether they do this sport and or others, and what does it teach us about just human movement? What methods that we would use to do this research? How might they be useful in analyzing and assessing human health and biomechanics and other scenarios as well? I think that's sort of the frame that you would have to, like, at this point in time, propose research, hypothesis driven research and, innovations in these different areas. Because not everyone is a tricker, but that's not to say that what you learn, the same way that like people ask, why go to space? Why do people, do all that? And because there's so many innovations and so much technology that we've reaped, benefits of back here on Earth, whether it's health or technology or material science developments or medical developments and so forth, that you would not see initially. So I think there's a lot of things with like tricking and biomechanics there that will affect trickers directly right away, but certainly could teach us way more about how the body functions musculoskeletally from a health and wellness and performance perspective. And I would imagine like from the physical therapy world, like there's probably maybe that's the lead in too. Like, it'd be interesting to see what Neil knows about, like, okay, like what amount of mocap data and things are already being done, not just in the PT realm to get you back to walking, which is relatively boring, but gets you back to like, oh, like you're doing performance now, and measuring your stability of your knee or something, post ACL reconstruction, in gearing up for a marathon or gearing up for soccer or something again like that. I'm sure there's more data in those realms, and maybe that's the doorway.
Yeah, I could agree with that. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's really it. Thank you so much, Kevin, for being on. This is a great discussion. I love talking about physics. So
thank you, guys. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, grateful for your time.
Thank you.
All right, I'll catch you guys later. You can catch his Kevin's Instagram in the link below. Our Patreon is also down there. Support us there. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. Bye.
Take care.